I own it, she said, her voice calm, but every word slicing through the room like glass. At that moment, Catherine froze. The woman they had erased from memory, Jasmine Carter, the scholarship girl they once scoffed at, now owned the mansion they were begging to rent. This isn't just a story about wealth. It's about memory, power, and who gets to rewrite the ending. So before we dive deeper into this tale of quiet revenge and poetic justice, tell us, where are you tuning in from? Miami? London? Lagos? Drop it in the comments. What do you think happens next when the girl they excluded becomes the one holding all the cards? The cafe buzzed with the low hum of wealth, polished laughter, soft clinks of porcelain, and the faint tap of Louboutin heels against marble. In a sunlit corner framed by floor-to-ceiling windows, 5 women gathered around a table that looked more like a runway staging ground than a casual brunch spot. Everything about them, from the gold-rimmed cappuccinos to the designer handbags perched like trophies, screamed curated perfection. At the center sat Catherine Whitmore, her platinum blonde bob razor-sharp, her posture untouched by time, and her voice the same one that had once ruled the high school halls with the effortless authority of a queen. She scrolled casually through her tablet, her manicured finger flicking away options with the disinterest of someone who had never heard the word settle. This reunion, Catherine began, not bothering to look up, has to be more than a party. It has to be a statement. Her tone wasn't open for debate, and none of the women challenged it. Around her, they nodded in perfect rhythm. Madison Lee, whose Botox smile never quite reached her eyes. Claire Donahue, the real estate heiress who collected husbands like Birkin bags. Sabrina Wynn, with her Pilates-toned arms and vague Instagram fame. And Paige Renner, the quiet shadow who still followed Catherine like an understudy waiting for her cue. They all sipped their drinks, murmuring agreement, pretending this was about nostalgia and not validation. Catherine finally set the tablet down, her diamond bracelet catching the light just enough to remind everyone at the table, intentionally or not, that some crowns never tarnish. We're not planning a high school reunion, we're curating an experience. It has to be exclusive, breathtaking, unforgettable. It has to scream, "Look at us now." No one questioned her phrasing because they all understood exactly who she meant by us. It wasn't the whole graduating class, it was the inner circle, the ones who mattered then and still expected to matter now. I've been scouting venues, Catherine continued, her voice smooth, rehearsed, and I think we should set our sights higher. No country club nonsense. We need something rare, something that whispers legacy and roars money. Claire leaned in, already intrigued, her fingers lightly tapping the side of her glass. Like that estate in the hills with the private garden and the infinity pool? Catherine gave a satisfied smile, the kind that confirmed she'd already thought of it. Exactly. The Elms. It's private, almost impossible to book. But I know someone who knows someone. It's not about affording it, it's about deserving it. The others exchanged glances, the air thickening with a mixture of ambition and insecurity. That was Catherine's true gift, not just making others want what she had, but making them question if they were worthy of having it too. We want people to walk in and feel like they missed out on something grand just by not being us, she added, adjusting her sunglasses though they were already perched perfectly. The goal wasn't just to host an event, it was to perform successfully in a way that felt unattainable to anyone on the outside. As the conversation shifted toward floral arrangements and high-end catering, the guest list came into focus. Catherine reopened her tablet and began reading names like they were assets. Each mention came with a commentary. Harper Langford? Married to a hedge fund guy. Definitely. Noah Jennings? Has a vineyard now. Absolutely. The list was less about reconnecting with classmates and more about curating an audience that would reflect their glow. Then Paige, always the one to ask the offbeat question, tilted her head and asked, "What about Jasmine Carter? She was in our class, right?" The question hovered like static in the air. Catherine's finger froze mid-scroll. "Jasmine Carter," she repeated like trying to place an old misplaced bookmark. "Oh, right. The scholarship girl." Claire raised an eyebrow. "The one who used to wear the same 3 cardigans all year?" Madison snorted softly into her drink. I think she spent more time in the library than the cafeteria, Sabrina offered. Wasn't she the one who won some science thing senior year? But the tone wasn't admiration. It was mild amusement, as though recalling a background character in a story they'd already rewritten. Catherine gave a dismissive wave. Honestly, I don't think she'd feel comfortable at the Elms. It's not her scene. And just like that, Jasmine Carter's name vanished from the list as easily as it had appeared, swept away not with malice, but with something colder, irrelevance. No one argued. No one asked where she was now. No one considered that 13 years might have changed more than a wardrobe. To them, Jasmine still existed in sepia, brilliant perhaps, but dimmed by social invisibility. They moved on, laughing louder now, basking in the certainty of their plans and the assumption that the world still worked in their favor. Outside, the Miami heat shimmered across the glass, the same way the past shimmered behind them, distorted, selective, self-serving. In their eyes, they had already won. They just needed the perfect stage to remind everyone else. What none of them knew, not yet, was that the stage had already been claimed. And the girl they had once erased was no longer waiting in the shadows. She owned the spotlight now. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the polished table as the women continued to refine their list, line by line, name by name, sifting through memories not for meaning, but for market value. Catherine tapped her manicured finger against the rim of her espresso cup, her eyes flicking between the screen and her curated notes like a producer casting for a reality show. Madison leaned in closer, her phone screen glowing with a cross-referenced social media feed, double-checking each alum's aesthetic before they earned a seat at the proverbial table. Chelsea Grant has a skincare line now. Looks like she's doing well, she said, earning an approving nod from Catherine. Claire chimed in with, Lucas Haynes just opened a rooftop bar in New York. His Instagram is all models and skyline views. As though follower count equated to character. This wasn't about rekindling old friendships. It was about handpicking witnesses to their carefully performed success. They were halfway down the list when a name flickered across the screen like a glitch in their glossy narrative. Paige, who rarely spoke without first scanning Catherine's expression for approval, squinted slightly and murmured, What about Jasmine Carter? The moment she said it, the mood cracked. Not enough to break, but enough to register. A subtle tightening of shoulders, the faint pause in Catherine's scrolling, the way Claire suddenly reached for her wine glass with more force than finesse. No one replied right away. It was as if the name itself didn't belong, not just on the list, but in the room. Catherine finally exhaled a low, measured breath, tapping her nail against the screen. Jasmine Carter, she repeated, tasting the name like it was something foreign. Oh, her, the scholarship girl. Right. There was no cruelty in her tone, only detachment, the kind that suggested the memory had no shape until now. Claire's voice rose, faintly bemused. She always had her nose buried in some giant book, remember? Never came to dances, always dressed like she raided a librarian's clearance rack. Laughter followed, not mocking, not overt, but the kind of laughter people reserve for remembering something that never threatened them. She was smart, though, Sabrina added, though her tone made smart sound more like a medical condition than a compliment. Didn't she win something? Science, biology, whatever? Madison waved her hand dismissively, already bored. Probably working at some lab or teaching at a college. You know the type. Quiet, harmless. Catherine's lips curled into a small, dry smile. Well, I doubt she'd really vibe with the event we're planning. I mean, the Elms isn't exactly a cardigan and book club setting. Her voice wasn't raised, yet her words sealed Jasmine's fate without question. No vote was needed, no disagreement voiced. Jasmine Carter, whoever she'd become, would not be part of their reunion. It wasn't personal, it was structural. In their world, exclusion was rarely loud. It was subtle, clean, and final. The list moved on. Another glass was poured, another story shared, another memory polished until it sparkled the way they wanted it to. Yet something about Jasmine's name lingered in the edges of their conversations, like perfume caught on a breeze long after the person had passed. Paige, ever the quiet observer, glanced again at the tablet, her brow furrowing ever so slightly, as if something didn't quite sit right. But Catherine's presence was too commanding, her vision too decisive, and Paige swallowed her uncertainty with a sip of rosé. Outside the cafe, the world went on. Cars crawled past on the boulevard, pedestrians laughed into their phones, and the sky deepened into amber. Inside, the women finalized their draft of a guest list so heavily edited it no longer resembled a class reunion, but a celebration of curated visibility. The kind of event that made others feel like they'd missed something important because they had not been chosen. And Jasmine? She wasn't forgotten. She was removed. With a tap of a screen and a passing comment, she was assigned a place outside the velvet rope they'd mentally erected around their event. They didn't wonder where she was, what she'd become, or if she'd even want to be part of something like this. To them, Jasmine Carter had always been on the outside looking in, and in their minds that hadn't changed. But what none of them realized, what none of them even thought to consider, was that Jasmine hadn't been standing on the outside for a very long time. And unlike them, she didn't need an invitation to know her worth. She had built something far more powerful than memories or appearances. She had built her life, quietly, brilliantly, and very soon her name, the one they dismissed in passing, was about to mean everything. The search began with the same confidence that had carried Catherine through every curated chapter of her adult life. With her iPad in hand and her espresso barely touched, she sat cross-legged in her home office. A room wrapped in cream and gold, with sleek glass shelves holding designer coffee table books no one ever read. Across her desk lay a spread of glossy brochures and printed email chains, each promising a slice of luxury more extravagant than the last. She believed truly that all she had to do was choose. And why wouldn't she? Her world had always bent to her will, had always opened doors at the lightest knock. This would be no different, until it was. The first, unfortunately, were booked for that weekend, arrived with a polite smile in a cursive font email signature. Catherine didn't flinch. The second one came just hours later, and the third, more formal, more final, slid into her inbox before she finished lunch. By the end of the next day, she had received 7 rejections. Some were curt, others apologetic, but they all carried the same sting of unexpected limitation. Her brow began to crease in a way it hadn't in years, an irritation that couldn't be massaged away by luxury skincare or smoothed out with yoga and chamomile. She called in favors. She name-dropped. She even offered to pay double for peak weekend access, assuming the magic of money would do what charm could not. But the universe seemed, for the first time in her life, unimpressed by her social resume. Madison tried to soothe her, insisting that the right place would appear. Claire offered the name of a country club where they could glam up a little. Catherine's smile was tight when she replied, "I'm not planning a retirement banquet. This isn't just a gathering, it's the statement of the decade." And to her it was. This event wasn't about nostalgia. It was about staking their place atop a ladder they'd never admitted was still standing. That was when the assistant, young, nervous, and new, slid a printed flyer across Catherine's desk with 2 fingers, as if unsure whether he was offering salvation or suicide. "There's a property that's not listed publicly," he said carefully, "but I heard from a friend who catered there last month. It's called the Elms Estate. Supposedly, it's breathtaking." Catherine didn't look up immediately. She studied the image, one perfectly lit photograph of a coastal mansion perched like a secret above the ocean. All clean lines and soft edges, its windows reflecting nothing but sky and power. She felt her heart shift. This wasn't just a venue. It was the venue. She typed the inquiry herself, discarding her usual assistant-forwarded approach. The reply came quickly, almost too quickly, with professional efficiency. "Thank you for your interest. The Elms is a private estate and available for select events. Weekend rates begin at $15,000. Additional fees may apply. Please note, all bookings must be approved by the owner." Catherine read it twice. The price didn't faze her. If anything, it thrilled her. High cost meant exclusivity. Select approval? That just added intrigue. She pictured it already. The 5 of them on the terrace. Champagne flutes raised as the sun melted into the horizon, guests murmuring in awe, wondering how they pulled it off. When she shared the update in their group chat, the reactions were instant and effusive. Madison sent clapping emojis. Sabrina texted, "That's exactly the energy we need." Claire replied with a photo of herself in a floor-length gold dress captioned, "Manifesting this backdrop." Catherine smiled as she watched their excitement bloom, unaware that under the foundation of her plan, a fault line had already begun to form. They scheduled the site tour immediately. Linda, the estate's property manager, was polite but formal on the phone, asking detailed questions about guest count, type of event, level of service. Catherine responded with practiced poise, listing off luxury florists, celebrity DJs, and custom lighting designs, her tone floating just above condescension. She wanted Linda to know they were not some desperate party planners. This was high society resuming its rightful place. The morning of the tour, they dressed like women prepared to make a memory. Chic but casual, affluent but not loud. The drive up the coast was filled with laughter and speculation. Paige played soft jazz on the stereo, while Sabrina practiced the poses she would use by the pool. Claire whispered that she hoped the bathtub had a chandelier. No one questioned whether they would get the property. The only question was which shade of elegance they'd paint onto it. As they approached the estate, the iron gates opened with hydraulic grace, revealing a manicured drive flanked by flowering hedges and whispering palms. The house emerged like a vision: smooth stone, sharp corners, windows that didn't reflect the world but reframed it. Linda greeted them at the front, clipboard in hand, her demeanor calm and efficient. "Welcome to the Elms," she said. "I'll be guiding you through the space. Please let me know if you have any specific requests for your event." They toured in hushed awe. Every room outdid the last. Custom woodwork, art that didn't scream wealth but murmured pedigree, a scent in the air that could only be described as expensive. Catherine said little, but her eyes missed nothing. When they reached the terrace and took in the panoramic view of the sea, she turned to Linda and said, "We'd like to book it immediately. October weekend. Full buyout." Linda gave a professional nod. "That date appears to be open, but final approval will need to come from the owner. I'll confirm with her directly this evening." Catherine smiled, pulling out her checkbook. "Perfect," she replied, pen poised over the line. "What's the owner's name, by the way?" Linda glanced at her tablet, answering without a second thought. And that's when everything changed. But that moment belongs to another chapter. Catherine's pen froze mid-stroke, her hand suspended above the checkbook like a still frame in an otherwise fluid performance. For a woman who had never learned to hesitate, this pause was jarring. Linda's voice had been perfectly neutral, businesslike, even pleasant. But the words echoed far louder than their volume deserved. "The owner," she had said, "is Jasmine Carter." It was a name spoken without weight, but to Catherine, it landed like a verdict. The same name that had been so casually erased from the reunion guest list now sat on the deed to the very estate they were desperate to claim. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, stretching over the marble floors and crystal chandeliers like a fog. Madison's phone slipped slightly in her hand, her mouth opened just enough to betray the sudden break in her composure. Sabrina turned toward Catherine, waiting for a cue, but none came. Claire blinked twice, as though the name might change if she gave it a moment. Paige, ever the observer, said nothing at all, though her eyes had never left Catherine's face. And Catherine, she was still, as if movement might confirm the reality she now desperately wished to question. "Carter?" Catherine finally asked, her voice lighter than usual, as if testing whether this was truly the same girl they had once relegated to the back row of every classroom and every memory. Linda, unfazed, nodded. "Yes, Jasmine Carter. She purchased the Elm several years ago. Very private, but she hosts a few events each year, strictly by request." The woman's tone was purely informative, devoid of any drama, completely unaware that she had just detonated a social bomb in the middle of an otherwise perfect afternoon. The group trailed behind Linda through the rest of the estate, but the energy had shifted entirely. The sweeping views no longer inspired wonder. They demanded explanation. The infinity pool, which just moments ago had promised envy and elegance, now shimmered with accusation. It was hers. Jasmine Carter's. The girl who had eaten lunch alone while they planned prom themes. The girl whose science fair victory had been squeezed between announcements for cheer tryouts. The girl who had been deemed unworthy of an invitation was now the gatekeeper of their fantasy. As they followed Linda down the staircase to the wine cellar, no one spoke. The hush wasn't reverent. It was heavy, almost burdensome. Each woman was lost in the same question. How? How had Jasmine Carter gone from invisible to untouchable? How had she leapt from discount notebooks and thrifted sweaters to a cliffside mansion with a wine library larger than most people's apartments? And more importantly, how had none of them seen it coming? Linda, still unaware of the tectonic shift behind her, continued the tour with practiced ease. This space is typically used for tastings or private chef pairings. The owner is very particular about guest behavior and discretion. She believes the home should be treated as a sanctuary. Catherine didn't respond, and neither did her entourage. In a single sentence, Jasmine had drawn the boundary they had never expected to encounter. She wasn't just successful, she was selective. And they, women who had built their lives on the assumption that access was their birthright, had no guarantee of inclusion. By the time they returned to the main living area, Catherine's expression had hardened into something unreadable. It wasn't rage, nor panic, but something colder, calculation. She handed Linda her card instead of the checkbook. "Once the owner approves the date," she said evenly, "please let me know, and we'll handle payment immediately." Linda nodded, promising a prompt response, then turned to escort them out. As they exited through the grand foyer, the massive doors opened onto the coastal wind, which now seemed to carry a hint of judgment. They walked in silence past the hedges and the elegant pathway, each of them rehearsing the same realization in different words. Jasmine Carter hadn't just climbed the ladder. They now stood beneath it, looking up. In the car, Sabrina finally broke the silence. "Do you think she knows who we are?" The question hung in the air like a dare. Madison scoffed, but it lacked conviction. "Please, she probably doesn't even remember us." Claire gave a short laugh, the kind of people use to fill space when they don't have answers. But Paige, speaking for the first time since they'd heard the name, said quietly, "I think she remembers exactly who we are. I just don't think it matters anymore." Catherine didn't respond. She sat stiffly in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the estate shrank behind them, swallowed by palm trees in silence. Her reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, slightly older, slightly shaken, slightly less in control. Jasmine Carter. The name had once meant nothing, a flicker in a sea of forgettable classmates. Now it was a lock on the door of her perfect plan, and she had no key. But Catherine Whitmore had never been one to lose without a fight. And if Jasmine stood in the way of the event Catherine had envisioned, if she now held the power to grant or deny entry, then Catherine would do what she always did when the world didn't bend easily. She would bend it harder. After all, wasn't she still the queen? That answer, however, no longer belonged to her alone. Long before the gates of the Elm swung open for Catherine and her entourage, Jasmine Carter had already stepped into a life they couldn't begin to imagine. But that transformation hadn't been sudden, and it hadn't been fueled by revenge. It was born in silence, in the quiet hours she spent alone in the school library while the others practiced for pep rallies, in the overlooked science fair victories and the books she devoured like lifelines. Jasmine had learned early that if you weren't invited to the table, you built your own, and she built hers with precision, resilience, and an unshakable sense of purpose. While Catherine and the others were curating their social ascent, hopping from sorority formals to destination weddings, Jasmine was attending lectures at MIT, surviving on coffee, sheer willpower, and the knowledge that no one was coming to save her. She buried herself in algorithms, network architecture, and artificial intelligence, fields dominated by men with legacy surnames and trust funds. They overlooked her the same way her high school classmates had, and Jasmine let them, because invisibility had become her camouflage. By the time they realized she was the smartest person in the room, she was already writing code they couldn't begin to understand. She didn't crave recognition. What she wanted was sovereignty. Jasmine never aimed to impress the world that once ignored her. She intended to outgrow it entirely, and that's exactly what she did. She met William Hartman in the most unremarkable of settings, a graduate-level seminar on optimization systems. He was golden-haired, sharp-jawed, and effortlessly charming, the kind of man who drew attention without trying, but Jasmine hadn't noticed him for that. What caught her attention was that he listened. When she challenged a professor's flawed logic in class, William didn't smirk or interrupt. He nodded. He scribbled down her insight, and later he asked if she wanted to continue the debate over coffee. It was the first time someone with power and presence saw her not as an anomaly, but as an equal. Their relationship bloomed far from the public eye. No grand declarations, no social media parades, just long nights solving problems, arguing about design principles, and laughing at things no one else would understand. William wasn't intimidated by Jasmine's brilliance. He was drawn to it. When he introduced her to his family, titans of the European tech scene, Jasmine stood in their glass-walled penthouse as if she'd always belonged there. And slowly she did. Not by assimilating, but by refusing to shrink. When they married, it wasn't on a Tuscan cliffside or in a Manhattan ballroom. It was on a private beach with 20 guests and no press. William gifted her the Elms as a wedding present, not because it was lavish, but because it was private, secure, and surrounded by nature, the way Jasmine had always dreamed. She transformed it into more than a home. It became a sanctuary, a retreat where she could write, consult, mentor, and breathe. Jasmine rarely opened the estate for events, only agreeing to a few each year that aligned with her values. Tech incubators, diversity forums, quiet weddings of old friends who couldn't afford the extravagance but deserved the beauty. She never imagined her high school would come knocking, not because she thought they wouldn't find her, but because she believed they wouldn't even look. And in a way they hadn't. They had walked straight into her life, blind to the woman she had become, still clinging to an old world that no longer revolved around them. And now they needed her. The moment Linda told her about the reunion inquiry, Jasmine didn't react. She simply stared at the email on her screen, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. Catherine Whitmore, Madison Lee, Claire Donahue. Names that once ruled lockers and lunch tables. Names that whispered, "You don't belong here." For years, Jasmine had buried those memories deep beneath the milestones of adulthood. Her first patent, her first million, her first keynote speech. But trauma doesn't always rot. Sometimes it ripens. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even amused. What she felt was something colder, quieter, clarity. They hadn't changed. They still curated lists, still measured worth by association, still decided who was visible and who was invisible. They didn't invite her because they never thought she could matter. And yet, here they were, standing in the foyer of her home, wearing smiles stitched together with entitlement, asking, unknowingly, for her permission. Jasmine stood on the terrace that evening, barefoot, a silk robe wrapped around her like armor. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, the sun falling gently into the water, and still, she didn't smile. She was thinking, not about what she could say, but about what she wouldn't. She wouldn't lecture them. She wouldn't rub their failure in their faces. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a story where she played the villain, because Jasmine Carter didn't need to punish them. Her life was the answer. Her silence was the sentence. So she turned away from the view and walked back inside. Her decision made, not from spite, but from power. They had erased her once, but now they would have to remember, not as the girl who was overlooked, but as the woman they couldn't overlook anymore. The phone sat like a loaded gun on Catherine's marble counter, silent and immobile, yet radiating pressure with the force of a spotlight. She had stared at it for the better part of an hour, her thumb hovering, retreating, hovering again. The estate's approval still hung in limbo, unspoken but implied, and every hour without an answer chipped away at her control. She wasn't used to waiting. She certainly wasn't used to needing anything from someone she hadn't deemed relevant in over a decade. But relevance, it turned out, had a cruel sense of timing. Jasmine Carter was no longer just a forgotten name from the past. She was the one person Catherine couldn't move forward without. There were 100 ways Catherine could have opened the conversation, some friendly, some performative, and a few rehearsed so many times they felt like lines from a script she no longer believed in. But none of them accounted for the thing she feared most, that Jasmine wouldn't just reject her, but would reject her gracefully. Because if Jasmine met her desperation with dignity, it would confirm everything Catherine had spent her adult life pretending wasn't true. That power had shifted, that the hierarchy had changed, and that the girl she once overlooked now outranked her in every measurable way. Finally, unable to bear the sound of her silence, Catherine dialed the number Linda had provided. It rang twice, then once more. And then a voice answered, familiar in tone, but firmer, more composed, with none of the hesitance Catherine remembered. "Hello, this is Jasmine." Catherine forced a brightness into her voice that tasted artificial even to her. "Hi, Jasmine. It's Catherine Whitmore. From high school? I'm not sure if you—" Jasmine cut her off gently but unmistakably. "I remember." Those two words sliced through the room like a scalpel. Precise, calm, and impossible to ignore. Catherine hesitated, her smile faltering even though no one could see it. "Wow, it's been so long, hasn't it?" she said, scrambling to reclaim control. "I heard you own the Elms now. First of all, congratulations. The place is stunning. Truly. We just toured it the other day and we fell in love with it." Jasmine didn't interrupt, didn't offer pleasantries or distractions. She simply waited. Catherine continued, her words tumbling too quickly, like pearls off a snapped strand. "The reason I'm calling is because we're organizing our high school reunion, 13th anniversary. Can you believe it? And we thought the Elms would be the perfect venue. It's exactly the kind of atmosphere we want. Elegant, intimate, exclusive." She laughed lightly, though nothing was funny. "We'd be honored to host it there, assuming you're open to that sort of thing." There was a pause, not long but long enough to signal that Jasmine wasn't rushing to make this easy. "Your reunion," Jasmine repeated, as though tasting the phrase before accepting it. "And who exactly is included in we?" Catherine rattled off a few names, trying to stick to those that might spark some semblance of connection, all while carefully avoiding the mention of the guest list Jasmine had been pointedly excluded from. "Just the usual crowd," she said, breezy but brittle. "A few of us stayed in touch over the years, you know how it goes." Jasmine's tone was neutral, but layered, like stone polished to a dangerous smoothness. "That sounds like a lovely group." Catherine smiled instinctively, then realized it was a mistake. Something in Jasmine's voice didn't match the words, and the unease returned with a new edge. Jasmine asked, "How many people are you expecting?" Catherine, now caught in the momentum of the pitch, rattled off numbers, vendor plans, catering menus, decor vision boards, all in the hope that professionalism would outweigh the personal history they both knew hadn't been forgotten. "It sounds like you've put a lot of thought into it," Jasmine said after a pause. "Very thorough, very selective." The last word landed with the weight of a verdict. Catherine's throat tightened. She could hear it now. The very thing Jasmine wasn't saying. She knew. She knew she hadn't been invited, and she knew that the offer only came because they'd stumbled into her empire like trespassers dressed for a garden party. Catherine pivoted, quick as ever. "Of course, the list is flexible," she said with an airy tone, even though her palms had gone cold. "We'd love for you to come too. I mean, we should have reached out earlier. Things just got so hectic. You know how it is." But Jasmine didn't answer the lie. She let it sit there, drying in the air between them like laundry left too long in the sun. "I'll think about it," Jasmine said at last. "Thank you for reaching out." Her voice was perfectly even, so professional it hurt. "I'll get back to you." And then she hung up. No dramatic ending, no slammed receiver, just silence. Catherine stared at the screen, her reflection dim in the black glass. She had walked into the conversation assuming she still held some version of the crown, if not the same one from high school, then at least one fashioned from polished adulthood and strategic charm. But now she wasn't sure she'd even been in the same room as the throne. She didn't tell the others right away. Instead, she sat in her immaculate kitchen, the light dimming, her thoughts spiraling towards something she wasn't ready to name. For the first time in a very long time, Catherine Whitmore felt small. Not because Jasmine had said no, she hadn't, not yet, but because she had said nothing at all. And that was worse. Because silence, wielded correctly, wasn't empty. It was absolute. 3 days passed. 3 long, brittle days, where every hour stretched like wire pulled tight across Catherine's nerves. The silence wasn't just an absence. It was strategic, measured, and suffocating. Jasmine Carter hadn't replied to the call, the message, or the polite follow-up email Catherine had sent with a carefully crafted tone of warmth, humility, and thinly veiled desperation. And yet, there was nothing. No confirmation, no refusal, just the void. It pressed against Catherine's composure like a slow leak, letting panic seep in one drop at a time. She checked her phone obsessively, pretending it wasn't an obsession. During meetings, at dinners, in the middle of yoga class, her thumb refreshed her inbox with a rhythm that betrayed her calm facade. Madison kept asking if the venue was locked, using her trademark chirpy tone, while Sabrina floated new theme ideas like it mattered. Claire was already picking out photographers, but Catherine could barely keep up the illusion. The clock was ticking louder each day, and the Elms, her pièce de résistance, was still out of reach. What made it worse was the nature of the silence. It wasn't passive. It felt deliberate, like a held breath Jasmine refused to release until she chose the exact moment to exhale. That knowledge stung more than Catherine wanted to admit. She had spent her entire life speaking first, leading first, and deciding first. And now she was at the mercy of someone she had once decided wasn't worth remembering. The irony had sharp teeth. When the call finally came, it was in the evening. Catherine recognized the number immediately and stood from her chair, as if posture could influence the outcome. She answered with a voice too bright, too prepared. "Jasmine. Hi. Thank you so much for getting back to me." There was a pause, not awkward, but intentional. Jasmine's voice when it came was soft and steady. "I've given your request a lot of thought." Catherine nodded reflexively, even though no one could see. "Of course, I know it's a big ask, and we appreciate your consideration. Truly." She tried to sound warm, grateful, and relaxed, but the words came out like lines in a scene she hadn't rehearsed well enough. Jasmine continued, her tone unfazed, her pace controlled. "I understand the significance of your event. I'm sure it means a great deal to you and your friends." Catherine held her breath. There was something about the way Jasmine said your friends that made her stomach twist. Not harsh, not bitter, but laced with the kind of restraint that felt like a verdict already rendered. Jasmine paused, then delivered the blow as gently and precisely as a scalpel. "Unfortunately, the estate won't be available for your reunion. I've decided to keep that weekend reserved for time with my husband and family." It was polite, impeccably worded, unarguable. But beneath the elegance, the message was unmistakable. "You don't belong here. Not in this house. Not in my life. Not anymore." Catherine's lips parted, then closed. Her mind scrambled for a pivot, an angle, an opening. "Oh, I mean, we could be flexible with the dates if another weekend is better. That's not a problem at all." "I'm afraid not," Jasmine said calmly. "October is reserved for personal use. I won't be opening the estate for events during that time." There was no anger, no smugness, just a door closing, quietly, permanently. "I wish you all the best with your reunion," Jasmine added, with sincerity so measured it felt almost surgical. "I'm sure it'll be memorable." The call ended, not with a bang, but with a click so soft it sounded like silk being folded. Catherine stood in the middle of her kitchen, phone still in hand, the room suddenly colder than it had been a moment before. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She simply exhaled and sat down, her legs barely finding the edge of the stool. Her empire hadn't crumbled, but something had cracked, something invisible, internal, and essential. Later that night, she told the group the estate was booked out after all, spinning the excuse with a shrug and a strained smile. They groaned, pouted, and offered backup suggestions with the kind of casual privilege that came from never wondering if a door was closed because of who you were. Only Paige watched Catherine a second too long, as if she saw the truth underneath the explanation. But Paige, as always, said nothing. They settled on a country club ballroom, refined, expensive, and utterly forgettable. The kind of place where events were photographed but never remembered. The reunion would go on, the outfits would sparkle, the drinks would flow, and the photos would be posted. But the shimmer would be synthetic, and somewhere deep down, Catherine knew it. The show would continue, but the spotlight had shifted. It wasn't hers anymore, and as she lay in bed that night, scrolling mindlessly through her camera roll, filled with curated proof of a life lived perfectly, she kept circling back to one image: the terrace at the Elms, the golden hour light, the sound of the sea, the view she'd never get. She pictured Jasmine standing there now, barefoot and calm, wine glass in hand, completely untouched by the chaos she'd caused. Or maybe Jasmine wasn't even thinking about her at all. That, Catherine realized, was the final sting. Not the rejection, not the silence, not even the loss of the perfect venue. It was the fact that, to Jasmine Carter, this entire ordeal had probably been nothing more than a brief inconvenience. And that was the deepest kind of power, walking away while the other person is still unraveling. The country club ballroom gleamed with polished chandeliers and rented ambition, the walls draped in white chiffon as if to disguise the mediocrity they couldn't quite conceal. The welcome sign read, 13th Anniversary Reunion, Class of Windsor High, but the letters looked tired, as though they had been cut and pasted from an event that once dreamed of being better. Outside, valet attendants yawned between Teslas and leased Bentleys. Inside, the music was too loud to talk and too forgettable to dance. Guests mingled under the soft clink of stemware and small talk, their conversations peppered with old stories no one truly remembered, and compliments that felt more like transactions. Catherine stood near the entrance, forcing a smile that had lost its edge hours ago. Her champagne flute, second, maybe third, rested in her manicured hand, though she hadn't taken more than a sip. Everything looked right. The flowers were expensive, the lighting warm, the catering appropriately fussy, but it all felt flat, hollow, like a party thrown in a room full of mirrors, reflective but never connective. Her friends buzzed around her, taking pictures, tagging each other, and laughing in short, deliberate bursts designed for social media, not for memory. No one said it out loud, but they all felt it. This wasn't what had been promised. The event Catherine had once declared would be the talk of the year had become just another high society gathering, attractive but disposable. Guests came, stayed long enough to post a story, and left with full purses and empty impressions. Even the nostalgia felt rehearsed, as if they were all too busy proving how far they'd come to remember who they used to be. The absence of the Elms loomed like a ghost in every corner of the room. They had imagined their silhouettes outlined by sunset, imagined candid photos with ocean wind lifting their hair, imagined the whispers from classmates asking, how did they pull this off? Instead, they were surrounded by cream-colored walls and hotel-grade acoustics. A few people asked why the venue had changed. Catherine blamed scheduling. Some nodded, some didn't, but no one was convinced. Paige, as always, stood off to the side, quietly observing. She hadn't said much since the estate fell through, but now and then her gaze would flick toward Catherine like a question left hanging. Madison made the best of things, snapping selfies in front of floral installations, while Sabrina cornered the DJ every hour to tweak the playlist. Claire hovered near the bar, talking to someone she used to date, or perhaps just someone who used to know her name. And Jasmine Carter? No one dared bring her up, not directly, but her name had taken root in the unspoken. It threaded through every glance Catherine cast at the doorway, every glance she caught in the mirror. The woman they'd excluded without hesitation now haunted the event like the shadow of the better version it could have been. Not because she had said no, but because her no had reshaped everything. Across town, the terrace at the Elms was bathed in lavender dusk. Jasmine stood barefoot, a linen wrap thrown over her shoulders, a glass of wine resting lightly in her hand. William sat nearby, flipping through a leather-bound book of poetry, his reading interrupted only by the low hum of the sea. The horizon stretched endlessly before them, open and unbothered. There was no music, no speeches, no clicking heels or artificial laughter. Just peace, just distance, just the life Jasmine had built on her terms. She had thought about the reunion only once since declining the invitation, not with bitterness or satisfaction, but with clarity. It wasn't the rejection that mattered, it was the principle. For years, she had accepted invisibility as currency, believing she had to trade silence for success. But now she knew better. She hadn't risen to prove anything. She had risen because she refused to be measured by a scale she hadn't helped create. And when the moment came to say no, not in spite, but in sovereignty, she did it not to wound, but to affirm. Back at the ballroom, Catherine slipped away from the crowd and into the hallway, her heels echoing too loudly against the polished floors. She stood in front of a mirror mounted between two sconces, smoothing her hair, adjusting her dress, doing everything she could to make herself look unshaken. But the truth lived behind her eyes. Jasmine's silence hadn't just been powerful. It had been surgical. It had removed Catherine from the fantasy she had so carefully crafted, leaving behind only what was real, that no amount of curated images or extravagant venues could mask what had already shifted. The reunion ended not with a bang, but with a quiet exit. Guests left in waves, careful not to be the last to leave something they no longer believed was impressive. The photos would be posted. The captions would be glowing. But beneath them, a different story would whisper. A story of a woman once erased, who now wrote her narrative from a home no one thought she could own. And Catherine? She would go home, pour another glass of wine, and tell herself it had all gone according to plan. But late into the night, she would scroll through her phone and stop at the photo, the only one not taken that evening. The photo of the elms taken on the day of the tour, sunlight streaming through glass walls. Her hand paused above the checkbook that would never be signed. That moment, frozen in time, was her true memory of the reunion. Not a toast, not a dress, not a dance. Just a name, spoken once, and never forgotten again. Because the price of overlooking someone isn't always guilt. Sometimes it's simply being left out of the life they built without you. The reunion may have ended, but the sting of humiliation hadn't faded for Catherine and her circle. What had begun as an elegant gathering meant to showcase their status had become a quiet disaster, a portrait of misplaced pride. But Catherine wasn't built to let things go, not when her ego had taken such a public hit. In the days following the event, group chats lit up with indignation thinly disguised as curiosity. Madison called it a power move, while Claire described it as unnecessary drama. Sabrina, never one to tolerate rejection well, was the first to say what they were all thinking. We need to remind her who she was. They didn't plot revenge in the traditional sense. There were no overt attacks, no nasty emails, no confrontations. That would have been too obvious, too classless for women like them. Instead, they did what they'd always done best, reframe the narrative. Claire reached out to a local society blog, suggesting a flattering behind-the-scenes piece on the reunion. Sabrina fed them select photos, curated for elegance, not authenticity. Madison started dropping Jasmine's name in cocktail circles, always with a knowing look and a loaded line. Well, she certainly made a choice, didn't she? They expected the whispers to work. They always had. When they controlled the story, they controlled the power. But this time something strange happened. The story didn't catch fire. It fizzled. The blog piece drew polite interest, but was quickly overshadowed by a more captivating narrative. An op-ed written by a well-known editor who had attended the reunion and noticed something off. Titled, "The New Power Class, When Exclusion Meets Ownership," the piece didn't mention names, but the subtext was razor sharp. It praised the quiet, poised presence of the woman who hadn't needed to attend the reunion to own it, literally and metaphorically. Catherine read the article twice, then a third time, her jaw tightening with each paragraph. The public wasn't rallying behind her curated version of events. Instead, they were elevating Jasmine, admiring her dignity, her silence, her restraint. Suddenly, people weren't just asking who she was, they were asking how she'd done it. A few even started referring to her not just as the woman who owns the elms, but as the one who redefined the guest list. Still unwilling to admit defeat, the group tried one final move, hosting a charity brunch, something high profile, meant to remind the city who still held social clout. They secured a top-floor venue, a luxury florist, and a Michelin star chef. Invitations went out to all the right names. But on the morning of the event, the sky cracked open with rain, the elevator system failed, and half the vendors arrived late. Guests whispered about the chaos, but what turned heads was who didn't show up. Jasmine. Not only had she been invited this time, but her RSVP had come with polite ambiguity. "I'll see if I can make it." She didn't make it. She didn't need to. Her absence was the loudest thing in the room, because while they clinked glasses and forced laughs under flickering light fixtures, Jasmine had been photographed across town, at a tech summit, seated on a panel between CEOs and investors, speaking about equity and innovation. The image went viral by that evening. Her poised silhouette against a backdrop of real influence told a story no party or Instagram post could compete with. The comments weren't just admiration, they were alignment. People wanted to know her, follow her, be her, and suddenly it became clear. No brunch, no blog, no guest list could rewrite what had already been rewritten. Jasmine Carter wasn't part of their world anymore. She had become the world they wanted to be part of. That night, as Catherine scrolled through Jasmine's growing press mentions, her hand clenched around her glass just a little too tightly. The others were quiet in the group chat, no new photos, no recap threads, just a shared, unspoken understanding. They had tried to remind Jasmine who she used to be, but all they'd done was remind themselves of who they no longer were. And Jasmine, she didn't lift a finger. She didn't need to. And that's the story. Quiet power, graceful boundaries, and the kind of success that doesn't need to shout. What would you have done in Jasmine's place? Would you have said yes or walked away just like she did? I'd love to hear your thoughts, your reflections, or even your own stories of being overlooked and rising anyway. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. Your time and attention mean everything. Until next time, stay bold, stay kind, and remember, sometimes the most powerful answer is simply no. See you soon.